The Wolf Among Us is a prequel video game to the long-running Fables comic series. The premise of both game and comic is simple. All of the Fables of Brothers Grimm fame are refugees in our world after having to flee their own, and now live in hiding in an enclave in New York called Fabletown. The main character of both comic and game is Bigby Wolf, the big bad wolf of legend, now reformed as the sheriff of Fabletown.
Submit a damage report with my office. Fabletown will pay for this.
The Wolf Among Us has a dynamic storyline that shifts and reacts to the dialogue choices you make for Bigby, and the game is easily one of the smartest takes on fairy tales you'll find in any medium. One of the themes inherent in any modern-day take on fairy tales is postmodernism, the fun in the premise seeing how fairy tale characters slot into a modern world, of juxtaposing the mythos of the original stories with the mundane of everyday life. The Fables aren't mythical characters anymore, no longer princes and damsels and monsters, they're all just people now trying to get by.
What are you doing here?
Same as anyone. It's a place where I am. Where else am I supposed to be?
But more than just seeing how clever the writer can be in fitting the jigsaw pieces of fairy tale and modern day together, The Wolf Among Us is interested in the deeper thematic resonance to be mined in looking at the consequences of the original fairy tales, in what happens when you strip fairy tales of their gravitas, and the complexities and nuances of how the big bad wolf would deal with his past in the modern day. Though the comic series was started back in 2002, 12 years before The Wolf Among Us was released, my introduction to the Fables universe came first through the game, and after finishing it I went on to read the comics, and was almost immediately disappointed. The thing is, while The Wolf Among Us is a nuanced and complicated take on fairy tales, the Fable comics aren't. They're not badly written, but they're only interested in that fun surface level of draping fairy tales over the modern day, without any real engagement with how that changes or complicates them. Every way The Wolf Among Us engages with the specifics of the original fairy tales, the comics don't. Now, initially, the comic series does actually do some smart things. So Fabletown isn't ripped apart from internal conflicts, all inhabitants are granted blanket immunity for past crimes in their old world. And to protect from the outside mundane world, they're also forbidden from revealing their magical identities. While for the human fables this is easy enough, for inhuman fables like trolls or talking frogs, it requires purchasing expensive spells, called glamours, to disguise themselves, or risk being shipped off to a farm outside the city.
If you can't afford to look human, you're going to the farm. It's as simple as that.
Bigby, they're bleeding me dry, mate. The quality of the spout goes down, but the rates keep climbing up. Do you have any idea how much it costs to have an entire family in glamour?
So far, these are a great example of taking advantage of the Fabletown premise. They're logical extrapolations, and they set the stage for interesting conflicts. Both comic and game explore those conflicts, but do so in fundamentally different ways. A few issues into the comics, those inhuman fables on the farm rebel and try to take the reins of power for themselves. This is actually one of the few places the comics really engage with the original fairy tales and make full creative use of them. There's an especially funny reference to Goldilocks having gone native with the three bears from her story and now working as a terrorist and freedom fighter for inhuman fables, but there's very little long-term value to the storyline. The rebellion is put down after a few chapters, but there's no change to the Fabletown status quo, no growth for any of the characters involved, no examination or deconstruction of the themes of the story or original fairy tales. Instead of being a fun little side story, the tensions between humans and non-human fables makes up the core of The Wolf Among Us. A deep trench of bitterness separates the haves from the have-nots, with inhuman fables ignored by the Fabletown government and treated like second-class citizens.
Where were you when we reported this weeks ago, huh? Where are you when we ever fucking need you? If you'd give 1 ounce of a shit about her, about any of us, she might have been saved. She might have been cared for.
It's actually remarkably similar to real-life ethnic enclaves at the turn of the century. In trying to solve the first murder of a fable in years, Bigby has to navigate a Fabletown where Beauty and Beast, like a lot of refugees, were wealthy in their home country but now find themselves resorting to less than savory ways to pay for a lifestyle they can no longer afford. Where racial resentment between those who can pass as the native population and those who can't is high. Where the weak institutions of the Fabletown government have allowed an organized crime element to rise to power and take advantage of the vacuum in Fabletown.
When your government abandoned you, left you poor and helpless, sniveling on street corners, I was there to look out for you.
Bigby himself operates in a really interesting liminal space between the two classes of fables. Viewed as a traitor and Uncle Tom by one side, while also never fully accepted by the other. Despite the clemency granted to all fables for their crimes in the old world, no one's really forgotten who and what Bigby is.
I'm not saying it's fair, but it's real. People are scared of you. I mean, look at your hands.
This is an aspect of Bigby that isn't explored in the comics, and his reasons for taking on the office of sheriff aren't either. It's suggested at one point that he came to Fabletown reformed from his old ways because of his interest in Snow White. And it's not a bad motivation per se, it's just that it isn't explored more than that. There's no character growth, no struggle in trying to refrain from violence despite his enjoyment and affinity for it. No conflict between his old ways and the new person he's trying to be. No emotional toll in the suspicion the other Fables view him with, no personal cost in what he's doing. The best example of this is the introduction of Red Riding Hood a dozen or so issues into the comics. With the Big Bad Wolf as a main character, you might think one of his former victims showing up would be a complicated and thorny issue, but you'd be wrong. There's a single page where Red Riding Hood is upset by Bigby being the sheriff and forgiven for his crimes in the old world, but it's quickly discovered that she's not actually Red Riding Hood, and instead an evil witch in disguise. Narratively, her appearance is simply a ploy by the villains that once discovered isn't commented on again. There's no emotional or thematic conflict in it, no examination of the complicated relationship between former abuser and victim, of how to reconcile past wrongs, of the bitterness Red Riding Hood should feel over how the other Fables have accepted the monster that once terrorized them all. The real Red Riding Hood does eventually show up later, but she has even less to do with Bigby than the fake one. While Red Riding Hood doesn't appear in The Wolf Among Us, the game does confront Bigby with an element from his original fairy tale: the woodsman.
If you keep on like this, I won't have any choice but to put you down.
Put me down? You got a shit fucking memory, Wolf. That's not how it went last time.
His relationship with Bigby is nuanced. Instead of the hero of the story as he was in the Homelands, in Fabletown he is a drunk and abuser of women, and resents Bigby. He's the hero of the story, not Bigby, so why is he a suspect in a murder case? Doesn't anyone remember what Bigby is? What he's done? These are interesting questions that spring from the original fairy tale and ones that go unasked in the comics. They're also used for character growth. Depending on your choices in the game, there can be a distinct arc with Bigby and the woodsman finally burying the hatchet and reaching an understanding with each other. Bigby's motivation in becoming sheriff in The Wolf Among Us is positioned as less about Snow and more about reforming his image and identity as a whole, and this motivation informs all of his actions in the game. The constant friction between lapsing back into his old Big Bad Wolf persona to speed the investigation along, and the new order-abiding and non-violent one he's trying to forge. And despite his best efforts, there's a real undertone throughout the game that he may be needed because of his ability to inflict violence, but because of exactly that, he'll never be trusted. It's a really nuanced way of engaging with the consequences of the original fairy tale and using it to inform character growth and theme.
I've heard it said that maybe in some tiny little bottled up way deep inside, you kind of enjoy it when things go wrong. Because it gives you an excuse to just, stop pretending.
Part of the reason the game is so much better at exploring these themes than the comics is down to both the difference in the medium and genre. The main mechanic of The Wolf Among Us is decision-making and dialogue choice, and the more complex and multifaceted the characters and conflicts, the more interesting it is to play. And the noir detective genre is simply a better vehicle for exploring those small, personal tensions and conflicts than the superhero war story of the comics.
I think she was off the Monday drugs, but she was hooking to pay down debt. It ate me up to see her that way.
Moral relativism is a hallmark of noir, which makes creating nuanced characters easier, and a murder mystery by its nature requires the detective to move through the different stratas of society and puzzle out the motivations and nuances of suspects and witnesses. There's also just 100 small ways the presentation of The Wolf Among Us reinforces the unglamorous nature of Fabletown. The neon lights that drench the world, the constant graffiti in the background, the thick atmosphere of the music, Bigby's wariness in quiet moments, the way his fridge is empty. Even the titles of the comics and games set them apart. Fables is a generic and vague title, The Wolf Among Us specific, intriguing, and hints at the liminal space Bigby occupies, the themes of fear and belonging. None of this is to say that the original Fable comics are bad. They're not. They're well written and well drawn, but they're not everything they could be, not as brilliant as their premise promises. The fairy tale elements in them are just draped over a conventional plot, the connections only skin deep. Thanks for listening. If you liked this video, hit the thumbs up button, and if you really liked it and are interested in hearing more, hit the subscribe button or check out some of my other videos. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you next time.